He had given up on second chances. She had long stopped believing she deserved one. When Caleb Foster moved to the quiet town of Silverpine with his silent young son, the last thing he expected was to find healing in the most unexpected place, a struggling music teacher with scars of her own. Their meeting wasn't fate, it was a choice. A choice to trust. A choice to heal. A choice to love again. And it would change all three of their lives forever. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The moving truck pulled away from the curb, leaving a trail of dust in the quiet air of Silverpine. Caleb Foster stood on the cracked stone steps of the old White House, a key heavy in his hand, a 5-year-old boy pressed tightly to his side. Leo's small fingers clutched Caleb's jacket sleeve with silent desperation, his wide green eyes scanning the unfamiliar street without saying a word. Caleb crouched down and ruffled Leo's sandy hair, offering a soft smile he didn't entirely feel. "This is it, buddy. Our new adventure." Leo didn't respond. He hadn't said anything for almost 6 months, not since that rainy October night when the world had fallen apart and his mother had slipped away in a sterile hospital room. Caleb's heart ached with the weight of it. He straightened and pushed open the front door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight, illuminating an empty living room with scuffed hardwood floors and a fireplace framed in weathered brick. The house smelled of old books and forgotten summers. It needed work. A lot of it. But Caleb had chosen this place for a reason. Silverpine was a small town, tucked against rolling hills and thick forests. It was a place where time seemed to move slower, where people might not look at Leo with pitying eyes or whisper behind their hands about the poor boy who lost his mom. He stepped inside, Leo clinging to his leg, and took a deep breath. They could make this work. They had to. In the days that followed, Caleb threw himself into repairs. He sanded, painted, hammered until his arms ached. Anything to fill the silence. Anything to avoid the hollow space where laughter and bedtime stories used to live. Leo watched quietly, following Caleb from room to room like a shadow. He never cried. He never laughed. He simply existed, small and silent. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Caleb realized he couldn't do it alone anymore. He needed help. Not therapists in stiff offices or well-meaning neighbors dropping off casseroles. He needed someone who could reach Leo, not through pity or clinical strategies, but through something real. That's how he found himself standing outside a narrow brick building on Main Street 2 days later. The sign above the door read, "Silverpine Music and Art Center," in faded blue letters. Inside, the space was small but warm, the walls lined with colorful paintings and framed sheet music. A worn upright piano sat in the corner, its wood polished to a soft gleam. Caleb almost turned around. What was he doing here? Leo hadn't touched the toy xylophone his grandparents had sent him for Christmas. He hadn't shown interest in anything. But then the bell above the door chimed softly, and a woman appeared from behind a partition. She wasn't what he expected. No severe bun or businesslike clipboard. She wore a loose cream sweater, her honey blonde hair tumbling down her shoulders in gentle waves. Her blue jeans were dusted with chalk from the blackboard behind her, and there was a faint smudge of paint on her wrist. And when she smiled, hesitant, but genuine, it was like someone cracked a window open in a room long sealed shut. "Hi," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm Ella Dawson. Can I help you?" Caleb cleared his throat, feeling suddenly awkward. "I was wondering if you do private sessions. For kids." Ella's smile softened. "We do." "How old?" 5. He glanced down. Leo stood half hidden behind his leg, eyes wide and wary. Ella crouched low, her voice warm and inviting. "Hey there, buddy." Leo didn't answer. He simply pressed closer to Caleb. Ella didn't push. She stayed crouched at his eye level, humming softly under her breath, an old lullaby, simple and sweet. Caleb felt a lump rise in his throat. After a long moment, Leo peeked out from behind Caleb's leg, his gaze flickering toward her. Ella rose to her feet slowly. No pressure. Maybe you both want to look around first. She gestured toward a cozy nook in the back, where instruments of all kinds were arranged, small drums, colorful keyboards, ukuleles, a worn acoustic guitar resting on a stand. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. They wandered together. Well, Caleb wandered, Leo clung. But Caleb noticed something, a tiny crack in the boy's shell. Leo's gaze lingered on the guitar. Ella noticed it too. She smiled, pulling a smaller guitar down from a hook. It was child-sized, its strings loose and worn. She strummed it lightly, the sound sweet and low. Leo's eyes widened. Ella knelt again, holding the guitar out, not forcing it, just offering. To Caleb's amazement, Leo took a cautious step forward. Tiny. Tentative. But forward. Leo's small fingers hovered over the guitar strings, trembling slightly. Caleb held his breath, afraid that any sudden movement or sound might break the fragile moment unfolding before him. Ella stayed perfectly still, her posture relaxed, her smile soft and patient. Finally, with a breath so small it was almost invisible, Leo plucked one string. The note was thin and imperfect, but it rang out clear, hanging in the warm air like a promise. Caleb swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. Ella's eyes flicked up to meet his, full of something he hadn't seen in a long time, hope. We can start slow, she said softly. No pressure. Just, letting him get comfortable. Caleb nodded, unable to speak. Over the next hour, Ella guided them gently through the small studio. She never asked Leo questions he couldn't answer, never forced him into anything. She simply played music, soft melodies on the guitar, a few notes on the piano, a simple rhythm on a small drum. And slowly, so slowly, Leo began to respond. He tapped a finger in time with the drumbeat. He pressed a single piano key. He watched Ella's hands with intense concentration, as if memorizing every movement. When the session ended, Caleb felt like he was walking on air and quicksand all at once. Ella knelt by Leo once more, her voice light. You did great today, Leo. Really great. Leo didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he didn't hide either. And that was something. As Caleb gathered Leo's jacket, Ella touched his arm lightly. If you want, we can set up a few more sessions. Just to see how he does. Caleb hesitated. He had built his life carefully in the months since the funeral. No deep roots. No messy entanglements. Just him and Leo against the world. But looking down at his son, at the faintest spark of life rekindling behind those solemn green eyes, he knew he couldn't turn away from this. Yeah, he said hoarsely. I'd like that. Ella smiled, a real one this time, bright and a little surprised. Good. Thursdays at 4 work. He nodded. As they left the studio, the sun dipped low over Silverpine, casting long golden shadows across the street. Caleb glanced back once, catching a glimpse of Ella through the window as she wiped down a piano bench, her movements graceful and unhurried. Something inside him shifted, subtle but real. He wasn't sure what it meant. He only knew that for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem like an empty, endless road anymore. The next few weeks settled into a new rhythm. Every Thursday, Caleb would bring Leo to the studio. And every Thursday, Leo would open up just a little more. He still didn't speak. But he laughed once, soft and quick, when Ella showed him how to make silly sounds by sliding a finger across guitar strings. He clapped his hands out of rhythm during a drum session, beaming when Ella clapped along with him. He started reaching for the guitar first thing when they walked in. Caleb found himself looking forward to those afternoons more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just for Leo. It was Ella. The way she greeted them with a smile that never felt forced. The way she knelt to Leo's level like he was the most important person in the room. The way her laughter filled the space like sunshine pouring through dusty windows. He learned little things about her in passing. That she loved mint tea more than coffee. That she lived in a tiny cottage on the edge of town with a garden she kept forgetting to weed. That she painted in the evenings when she couldn't sleep. But there were things she didn't say, too. Shadows that sometimes crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. Caleb recognized them. You didn't lose someone you loved and come out the other side without scars. One Thursday, after Leo had fallen asleep curled up on a beanbag chair in the corner, Caleb found himself sitting across from Ella at the old piano. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not pressing down, just feeling them. "You're good with him," Caleb said quietly. Ella smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I had practice." He hesitated. He wanted to ask. But he didn't want to push. Instead, he said, "Thank you. For everything." Ella looked up at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression softened. "You're doing better than you think, you know," she said. Caleb shook his head. "Most days I feel like I'm barely keeping us afloat." Ella's hand stilled on the piano. "Maybe that's enough for now," she said. "Maybe just staying afloat is the bravest thing you can do." Their eyes held for a long moment, the weight of unspoken things between them. Then Leo stirred, mumbling in his sleep, and the moment broke. But Caleb carried her words with him as he scooped his son into his arms and carried him out into the cool Silverpine evening. Maybe just staying afloat was enough. For now. The first real rain of the season came to Silverpine on a Thursday afternoon, hammering against the roof of the music studio in a steady, comforting rhythm. Leo sat cross-legged on the worn rug near the piano, strumming random notes on the small guitar Ella had tuned just for him. His tongue poked out in concentration, and a tiny crease formed between his brows. Caleb sat nearby, pretending to scroll through his phone, but really he watched them, watched Leo, and felt something inside him ease. Ella was sitting cross-legged too, her own guitar resting on her knee, matching Leo's clumsy strums with gentle, guiding chords. She sang softly under her breath, just fragments of melody, nothing polished or rehearsed. And for the first time in almost a year, Caleb heard something he had missed more than he realized, Leo's laughter. It burst out of him, bright and surprised, when Ella made a silly face mid-song. Caleb's head jerked up at the sound. His chest ached, tight with emotion. Ella glanced over and caught his eye, her smile widening. Leo didn't notice. He was too busy strumming, too busy laughing. Caleb swallowed hard and looked away, pretending to study a crack in the wall. He wasn't ready for this. For the way hope clawed at his ribs, messy and raw. For the way Ella's presence in their lives was starting to feel less like a kindness and more like a necessity. He couldn't afford to need anyone. Not again. After the session ended, the three of them lingered as the rain continued to pour outside. Ella made tea in a chipped kettle she kept in a tiny staff kitchen, and they sat together in the studio's makeshift lounge, Leo curled up in a beanbag, Caleb nursing a mug of black coffee, Ella tucked into a threadbare armchair with her legs folded beneath her. They talked about nothing at first, the weather, the town's upcoming harvest festival, the stubborn raccoon that kept raiding Ella's trash bins. But then the conversation shifted, almost without warning, into deeper waters. Ella was tracing the rim of her mug with her fingertip, her eyes distant. "I used to think music could fix anything," she said quietly. Caleb tilted his head. "Used to?" She smiled, small and sad. "Life has a way of teaching you otherwise." He wanted to ask. God, he wanted to. But the words felt heavy on his tongue, and he didn't want to push her away. Instead, he said, "It's fixed a lot for Leo." Ella looked over at the boy, who was now fast asleep, his small guitar clutched loosely in his arms. Her gaze softened. Maybe it still can. The rain continued to fall, a steady heartbeat against the windows. For a long moment, they just sat there, two broken people and a sleeping child, suspended in a fragile, perfect kind of peace. The next Thursday, Caleb arrived early. Leo had been restless all morning, tugging at Caleb's sleeve, pulling out his little guitar and plinking random, enthusiastic notes. Something was different. When they reached the studio, Ella greeted them with her usual warm smile, but there was a tension in her shoulders Caleb hadn't seen before. She seemed distracted, her laughter a little forced, her eyes darting occasionally to the phone on the counter. Caleb didn't ask. He knew better than anyone that some days were heavier than others. Instead, he helped Leo set up, tuned the small guitar for him, and sat back to watch. Leo strummed with surprising energy, banging out chaotic, joyful noise. Ella clapped along, her smile genuine this time, and for a little while, everything felt easy again. But midway through the session, the door burst open with a jangle of the bell. Caleb turned, startled. A man stood there, dripping wet from the rain, anger radiating off him like steam. Ella froze. The man's voice sliced through the cozy room. "Ella. You think you can just hide here?" Caleb rose instinctively, positioning himself between Leo and the newcomer without thinking. Ella's hands were shaking. She set her guitar down carefully, like she didn't want to spook anyone, and stepped forward. "Mark," she said quietly. "You need to leave." The man, Mark, laughed, harsh and bitter. "You think you can just run away from everything? That it won't follow you?" Caleb watched Ella closely. The fear in her eyes wasn't the kind you get from a bad argument. It was old. Deep. Familiar. Mark's gaze shifted to Caleb, sizing him up. "New boyfriend, Ella. Moving on fast, aren't you?" Caleb didn't flinch. He kept his voice even. "You need to go." Mark sneered but stepped back toward the door. "This isn't over," he said. Then he was gone, the bell jangling violently behind him. For a long moment, no one moved. Leo whimpered softly, clutching his guitar tighter. Caleb crouched beside him, murmuring soothing nonsense until the boy's breathing steadied. When he finally looked up, Ella was sitting on the edge of the piano bench, her hands balled into fists in her lap, staring at the floor. Without thinking, Caleb crossed the room and sat beside her. "Ella," he said gently. She shook her head, blinking hard. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let him, I thought he wouldn't find me here." Caleb didn't know what to say. All he knew was the raw ache in his chest at seeing her like this. Fragile. Shattered. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. Ella laughed, sharp and humorless. "No. But I will be." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them, something heavy and electric and real. Without thinking, Caleb reached out and took her hand. Ella flinched, but didn't pull away. They sat there in the silent studio, hands entwined, as the rain hammered against the windows and the past hung heavy in the air around them. Neither of them spoke. But for the first time, neither of them had to. The storm passed by morning, leaving Silverpine washed clean and glistening under a pale blue sky. The sidewalks were still damp, puddles catching the light like tiny mirrors. Caleb stood on the porch of the music center, shifting his weight from foot to foot, Leo perched on his hip. The boy rested his head against Caleb's shoulder, worn out from the previous night's tension. Inside, Ella was sweeping up dried leaves blown in by the wind, her movements slow, distracted. Caleb watched her through the glass door, his chest tightening. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to find this Mark guy and make sure he never came within 100 miles of Ella again. He wanted to take away the fear still etched into her features. But he knew too well, you couldn't fight someone else's ghosts. You could only stand beside them and wait. He pushed open the door, the bell chiming softly. Ella glanced up, startled, then relaxed when she saw him. She set the broom aside and offered a small smile. "Hey," she said, voice a little hoarse. Caleb returned the smile and set Leo down gently. The boy immediately wandered toward the corner where his guitar waited, picking it up with surprising urgency. Caleb stuffed his hands in his pockets. "We, brought breakfast." Ella blinked. Only then did she notice the brown paper bag he held up sheepishly. She laughed, a real laugh, soft and genuine, and Caleb felt something warm unfurl inside him. He set the bag on the counter and pulled out 2 steaming cups of coffee and a box of fresh pastries from the town's only bakery. Ella picked up a flaky croissant and took a tentative bite. Her eyes fluttered closed in exaggerated bliss. Caleb chuckled. "That good?" She nodded, her mouth too full to answer. Leo sat cross-legged nearby, plucking random strings on the guitar, utterly absorbed. For a little while, the morning unfolded gently, like a page turning in a well-loved book. They ate, they talked, about small things. Safe things. Ella told Caleb about the time a raccoon got into her kitchen through the cat door. Caleb shared a story about Leo's brief, disastrous attempt to help him paint the living room. They both laughed, easy and real. The heaviness from the night before didn't disappear. But it shifted, less a storm cloud now, more a distant echo. At one point, Caleb caught Ella watching him with a look he couldn't quite read. Something tender. Something vulnerable. He wanted to reach for her. God, he wanted to. But he stayed rooted to the spot, afraid that moving too fast might shatter the fragile thread between them. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "There's a fall festival this weekend. In town square. Thought maybe, you'd want to come. With us." Ella's eyebrows lifted slightly. "With you?" she echoed, teasing. "With us," Caleb clarified, nodding toward Leo, who was now strumming a clumsy rendition of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Ella smiled down at the boy, then back at Caleb. "I'd like that." Saturday arrived crisp and clear, the air smelling of cinnamon and wood smoke. Silverpine's main street was transformed, hay bales stacked into makeshift seating, booths overflowing with homemade jams and knitted scarves, children darting between caramel apple stands and pumpkin patches. Caleb held Leo's hand as they wandered, the boy's small fingers gripping his tightly. Ella walked beside them, bundled in a soft gray sweater, a knitted scarf wrapped around her neck. She laughed at Leo's wide-eyed fascination with everything, the pony rides, the giant pumpkins, the man carving animal shapes from blocks of ice. Caleb couldn't stop watching her. There was a lightness to her today, a shimmer he hadn't seen before. She smiled more easily, her laughter like music weaving through the crisp autumn air. They rode the Ferris wheel together, Leo tucked snugly between them. At the top, the town stretched out below, a patchwork of orange and gold. Caleb glanced sideways at Ella, the wind tugging strands of her hair loose from her braid. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked a piece behind her ear. His fingers brushed her skin, and Ella's breath caught. For a moment, the world narrowed to just them, the soft tilt of her head, the sudden shyness in her smile. Then Leo squealed in delight as the Ferris wheel jerked forward, and the moment dissolved into laughter. They spent the rest of the afternoon wandering, eating too much kettle corn, letting Leo drag them from one booth to another. When evening fell, they ended up at the edge of town square where a small stage had been set up for live music. Ella perched on a hay bale, Leo in her lap, Caleb standing nearby, arms crossed, watching them with a quiet, aching fondness. The band started to play, a slow, easy country song, and couples began to gather on the grass, swaying together in the fading light. Caleb felt a hand slip into his. He looked down, startled. Ella's fingers curled shyly around his, her cheeks pink. He squeezed back, heart hammering. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Later that night, after Caleb tucked the sleepy Leo into bed, he found himself pacing his living room, restless. The house was too quiet. Too empty. He grabbed his jacket and keys without thinking, driving the few short blocks to Ella's cottage on the edge of town. The porch light was on, casting a warm pool of light over the steps. He stood there for a long moment, heart in his throat, before finally raising his hand to knock. Ella opened the door almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting. Neither of them spoke. Instead, Caleb reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing over her skin with aching tenderness. Ella closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. And then, without hesitation, he kissed her. Soft. Sure. Full of every word he hadn't been able to say. Ella melted against him, her arms sliding around his neck, her body fitting against his like she was meant to be there all along. When they finally broke apart, breathless, she whispered against his lips, "I was scared you wouldn't come." Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I was scared I would." Ella laughed, a sound full of tears and joy all at once. Caleb kissed her again, deeper this time, the kind of kiss that felt like a beginning, and a promise. They stood there on the porch as the cool night air wrapped around them, two broken people finding something whole again. And somewhere deep inside, Caleb dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time, he wouldn't lose everything he loved. The days that followed blurred into a golden haze of stolen moments and tentative beginnings. Caleb and Ella fell into a rhythm so natural it was almost frightening. Breakfasts shared at the diner on Main Street, Leo perched between them coloring on napkins. Afternoons spent wandering the woods behind Caleb's house, Leo darting ahead like a small whirlwind while Caleb and Ella walked side by side, hands brushing, smiles shy and easy. Evenings curled up in Ella's living room, Leo fast asleep on the couch while they whispered stories and dreams they'd once been too afraid to speak aloud. It wasn't perfect. There were still nights when Caleb woke gasping from dreams of the hospital room, of soft beeping monitors and final goodbyes. Nights when he looked at Leo and felt crushed under the weight of how much he didn't know, how much he still feared he was getting wrong. There were still days when Ella grew quiet and distant, shadows clouding her bright eyes. Days when she would lose herself in painting for hours, as if trying to exorcise something she couldn't name. But somehow, they found a way through the cracks and the silences. Together. Leo flourished in ways Caleb had hardly dared to hope for. He still hadn't found his voice completely, but he smiled more now, laughed often, threw himself into music with a focus and joy that lit him up from the inside out. And Caleb found himself healing, too. Not in grand, sweeping ways. In small, steady steps. He learned to laugh without feeling guilty. He learned to sit in silence without drowning in it. He learned that maybe, just maybe, letting someone in again wasn't a betrayal of the past, but a way of honoring it. One Friday evening, as they sat together on Caleb's back porch watching fireflies blink against the twilight, Leo curled up between them with his head on Ella's lap. Caleb turned to her, heart full to bursting, and said the words he hadn't dared to say out loud before. "I love you." Ella's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she just stared at him, wide-eyed and fragile. Then, slowly, she reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "I love you too," she whispered. Caleb kissed her, soft and reverent, full of all the things they still couldn't say, and the world seemed to quiet around them, like it was holding its breath just for this moment. They were a family. Not by blood. Not by the clean lines of a family tree. By choice. By love. And for the first time in a long, long while, Caleb allowed himself to believe they might actually have a future. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It started with a phone call. Ella was locking up the music center after a late lesson when her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She almost ignored it. Almost. But something in her gut made her pull it out and answer. The voice on the other end was clipped, official. "This is Officer Reynolds from Silverpine Police Department. Is this Ella Dawson?" Her heart dropped into her stomach. "Yes," she managed. "We've picked up a man named Mark Bennett. He was found trespassing near your property tonight. We thought you should be informed." Ella swayed where she stood, gripping the edge of the counter to stay upright. Mark. He had found her again. The officer continued speaking, something about charges, restraining orders, paperwork, but the words blurred into meaningless noise. All Ella could hear was the blood pounding in her ears. All she could feel was the old fear coiling tight in her chest. She ended the call in a daze and stumbled outside, the night air sharp and cold against her skin. She couldn't do this. She couldn't drag Caleb and Leo into this mess. She had been a fool to believe she could have something good, something safe. Tears blurred her vision as she fumbled with her car keys. She had to end it. Now. Before she hurt them. Before she lost them too. The next morning, Caleb woke to an empty house. At first, he didn't panic. Maybe Ella had just gone to pick up breakfast. Maybe she and Leo were still sleeping. But when he checked Leo's room and found the boy alone, and when he found a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table with his name written on it in Ella's looping handwriting, his heart froze. He unfolded the note with shaking hands. Caleb. I'm sorry. This was never meant to be permanent. You and Leo deserve better than the chaos I carry with me. Thank you for everything. Please don't look for me. Ella. The paper fluttered from his fingers. For a long time, he stood there, staring at the spot where it had landed on the floor. Then he moved, mechanical, gathering Leo into his arms as the boy whined sleepily. He didn't have words. Not for Leo. Not for himself. All he had was the hollow ache in his chest, the crushing weight of loss settling over him all over again. He had let himself believe. He had let himself hope. And now. Now he was alone. Again. Days in Silverpine grew colder as October crept toward November. The brilliant leaves dulled and fell from the trees, leaving the town looking bare, stripped down to its bones. And Caleb Foster moved through it all like a ghost. He went to work. He picked up Leo from the music center, now painfully quiet without Ella's laughter bouncing off the walls. He cooked dinner Leo barely touched. He read bedtime stories in a voice that cracked and faltered. He functioned. But he didn't live. Leo felt the difference. The boy clung to Caleb more than usual, his small hands reaching for him in the middle of the night, his silent questions hanging heavy in the air. Where's Ella? Caleb didn't have an answer. He wanted to be angry, at her, at himself, at the universe. But mostly, he just hurt. It was like losing Anna all over again. That same hollow ache, that same clawing helplessness. Only this time, it wasn't death that had taken someone from him. It was fear. And the worst part was that he understood it. He couldn't blame Ella for running. He knew what it was to be so afraid of losing someone that you chose to leave first, to rip out your own heart before someone else could shatter it. He had done it himself once, in smaller ways. In colder, quieter ways. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Caleb found Leo curled up on the living room floor, his little guitar abandoned beside him. Caleb sat down heavily beside him, pulling the boy into his lap. Leo pressed his face against Caleb's chest, his small body trembling. For a long moment, they just sat there, wrapped in silence and sadness. Then, out of nowhere, Leo whispered. It was so faint Caleb almost missed it. Ella. Caleb's breath caught. Leo hadn't said a word since Anna died. Not one. Now, with a voice rusty and small from disuse, he said the one name that mattered most. Ella, he whispered again, clutching Caleb's shirt. Caleb closed his eyes, his throat burning. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Leo had found his voice for her. He had found his laughter, his music, his hope for her. And now she was gone. But Caleb wasn't ready to let go. Not this time. He pressed a kiss to Leo's hair and whispered, "We'll find her, buddy. I promise." Because family didn't walk away. Not when it mattered most. It took days of searching, asking quiet questions around town, calling in every favor he had left. Silverpine wasn't a big place. But fear made people invisible. Finally, he caught a break. An elderly woman at the diner mentioned seeing Ella's car parked near the old lake cabins on the outskirts of town. Caleb didn't even think. He just grabbed Leo, buckled him into the truck, and drove. The road twisted and narrowed as they left the main town behind, winding into thick woods heavy with mist and the scent of rain. Finally, he saw it. A small cluster of cabins, mostly abandoned for the season. And there, tucked between two skeletal trees, Ella's battered sedan. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as he pulled over and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the faint glow of light leaking from one of the cabin windows. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know if she would even listen. But he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving without her. He lifted Leo into his arms and walked toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier than the last. At the door, he hesitated only a second before knocking. There was a long pause. Then the door cracked open a few inches, the chain still latched. Ella's face appeared, pale and wary, eyes wide with fear. When she saw Leo, her hand flew to her mouth. "Caleb," she whispered. He took a shaky breath. "We need you," he said simply. Ella's eyes shimmered with tears. "I told you not to come." "I know," Caleb said. "But you don't get to decide that we don't love you." Leo squirmed in his arms, reaching one small hand toward her. "Ella," he said again, a little louder this time. Ella sobbed, fumbling with the chain, throwing open the door. Caleb stepped forward, and in the next instant, she had wrapped her arms around both of them, holding on like she was afraid they'd disappear if she let go. They stood there in the doorway, the cold mist swirling around them, hearts breaking and mending at the same time. Finally, Ella pulled back just enough to cup Caleb's face in her hands. "I'm scared," she choked out. "So am I," Caleb whispered. "But I'm more scared of a life without you." Ella kissed him then, desperate and sweet and full of all the words she couldn't say. And when Leo giggled against them, a bright, clear sound, Caleb knew. This was it. This was home. They drove back to town in silence, but it wasn't a heavy silence anymore. It was a silence stitched together with fragile hope, with the warmth of hands held tightly, with Leo's soft breathing from the back seat. Ella stared out the window, her fingers curled around Caleb's free hand on the center console. She didn't let go. Not when they passed the familiar storefronts of Main Street. Not when they turned onto the winding road that led to Caleb's old white house. Not even when they pulled into the driveway and Caleb shut off the engine. Leo clambered out sleepily, clutching his little guitar case, and Caleb lifted him into his arms. Ella hovered uncertainly by the truck, her body tense, like she was waiting for someone to tell her this wasn't real, that she had imagined it. Caleb walked over to her, Leo heavy against his shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just reached for her hand again, weaving their fingers together, and led her inside. The house smelled like cinnamon and soap and something faintly like fresh paint. It smelled like home. Caleb set Leo down gently, and the boy immediately toddled toward the living room, curling up on the couch with his guitar clutched to his chest. Ella stood awkwardly by the door, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes darting around the space like she didn't belong. Caleb crossed to her, his voice low and sure. "You're not a guest," he said. "You're part of this." Ella's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her forehead to his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her tightly, as if anchoring her to him. As if reminding her she was wanted. Needed. Loved. They spent the evening like that, moving carefully through the house like people learning a new dance, afraid to step on old wounds. Caleb made grilled cheese sandwiches and soup. Ella helped Leo string a few clumsy chords together on his guitar. They laughed, they stumbled, they tried. And when night fell and Leo was tucked safely in bed, Caleb found Ella standing on the back porch, staring up at the stars. He slipped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be." "I was so scared," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I had to protect you. Protect Leo. Protect myself." Caleb pressed a kiss to the side of her head. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." She turned in his arms, her hands framing his face. "I love you," she said fiercely, desperately. "I love you so much it terrifies me." Caleb smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "That's how you know it's real." Ella laughed through her tears, and Caleb kissed her, slow and deep, pouring every broken piece of himself into her. They stood there under the vast Silverpine sky, wrapped around each other, as the stars blinked above like tiny promises. The next morning, Caleb woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of quiet humming from the kitchen. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. But then he rolled over and saw Ella, barefoot and messy-haired, dancing Leo around the kitchen in slow, silly circles. The boys' laughter filled the house, high and clear and full of life. Caleb sat up, propping himself on his elbows, and just watched. Watched the woman he loved twirl with his son. Watched the family he hadn't dared to dream of forming around him. Watched a future unfold he hadn't believed he deserved. Ella caught him staring and blushed adorably. "You're awake," she said, setting Leo down with a giggle. Caleb stood, crossing the room in 3 strides, and pulled her against him. "I don't ever want to wake up without you again," he murmured. Ella's eyes softened. "You won't have to." He kissed her forehead, breathing her in, memorizing everything about this moment. Because he knew, life wouldn't always be easy. The past would still haunt them sometimes. There would still be nights full of doubts and fear. But there would also be mornings like this. Full of laughter and sunlight and second chances. And that was worth everything. Winter crept slowly into Silverpine, dusting the rooftops with frost and painting the mornings silver and blue. Caleb watched the seasons shift with a sense of wonder he hadn't felt in years. Every morning he woke to Ella curled against him, her hair a golden mess on the pillow, her breath warm against his chest. Every evening he listened to Leo's laughter bouncing through the house, a music more beautiful than anything he'd ever heard. Life wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. It was good. And it was theirs. One Saturday in early December, Caleb found himself standing in the back room of the music center, heart pounding harder than it had on any corporate boardroom floor. Leo was perched on a stool, swinging his legs and watching him with wide, curious eyes. Ella was inside, setting up for the town's winter recital, oblivious to what Caleb had planned. He knelt in front of Leo, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Leo leaned forward, fascinated. Caleb opened it, revealing a simple but beautiful ring, a small sapphire tucked between 2 tiny diamonds, delicate and bright. "What do you think, buddy?" Caleb asked softly. Leo grinned, a real, full grin, and clapped his hands together. Caleb smiled back, nerves and love and hope tangling inside him. "Do you think she'll say yes?" he whispered. Leo nodded so emphatically his whole body bounced. Caleb ruffled his hair, feeling something tight and fragile crack open inside him. Maybe he deserved this. Maybe they all did. The recital that evening was pure Silverpine magic. The little town hall was strung with twinkle lights and garlands of evergreen, the air thick with the scent of pine and cinnamon. Children clambered onto the tiny stage with ukuleles and tambourines and recorders, their faces bright with pride and excitement. Ella stood off to the side, her hands clasped nervously in front of her, smiling at every missed note and off-key song like it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. Caleb watched her, his heart a steady drumbeat against his ribs. After the last performance, as the audience clapped and cheered, Caleb caught Ella's eye and nodded slightly. Confused, she walked toward him. He met her halfway across the hall, dropping to one knee before he even had time to second-guess himself. The crowd gasped, then hushed into awed silence. Ella froze, her hands flying to her mouth. Caleb smiled up at her, the box open in his palm. "I don't have a big speech," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I just know that I want to spend every morning waking up beside you, and every night falling asleep knowing you're safe and loved." Ella's eyes flooded with tears. "I love you, Ella Dawson. I love the way you saved my son's heart. I love the way you saved mine. I love every brave, broken, beautiful part of you." He swallowed hard, his vision blurring. "Will you marry me?" For a long, breathless moment, Ella just stared at him, trembling. Then she nodded so hard she almost lost her balance. "Yes," she gasped. "Yes, yes, yes." The room erupted into cheers as Caleb stood, sliding the ring onto her shaking finger, pulling her into his arms and kissing her like he never wanted to let her go again. Leo barreled into them a second later, laughing and clapping and shouting a joyful, "Ella." They sank down onto the floor together, a messy, tangled heap of laughter and tears and love, and the world spun around them like a carousel of light and sound. Caleb held them both close and whispered, "Home. We're home." Ella pressed her forehead to his and whispered back, "Always." Life moved forward. There were wedding plans scribbled on napkins and burned dinners and late-night dance parties in the living room. There were sleepless nights when Leo had bad dreams and mornings when the three of them stayed curled up under the covers long past sunrise. There were moments of doubt and moments of pure, aching joy. They built a life out of those moments, out of broken pieces and brave choices and stubborn, unshakable love. Because family wasn't always blood. It wasn't always easy. But it was always worth it. And in the little white house on the edge of Silverpine, under skies heavy with stars and promise, Caleb Foster, Ella Dawson, and Leo Foster found the one thing they had all been searching for. A home. A future. Each other. Not perfect. But perfectly theirs. Always.